The air on the bridge of the Oath of Stone was thick with the ghosts of 10 centuries. It was a tangible presence, a compound of recycled oxygen, sacred incense, and the faint metallic scent of blood spilled and scrubbed away countless times. Every iron-chased console and brass-rimmed gauge bore the scratches and dents of campaigns fought before the current High Lords of Terra had even been born. Lord Marshal Evgeny Voronezov felt the weight of that history in his bones, an ache as profound and constant as the low thrum of the flagship's plasma drives. He stood before the vast observation window, a giant in archaic, ornate carapace armor, his long gray coat trimmed with the fur of some great beast slain on a world whose name was now dust. His face was a roadmap of 1,000 years of war, creased and scarred with eyes that had witnessed the death of stars. Below him the planet Hordel burned. It was a cleansing fire, a holy conflagration delivered by the macro cannons of his fleet. The Vostroyan 77th Army Group, a force of 10 million souls, had been prosecuting this final battle for 3 standard years. The world had been a bastion of the archenemy, a festering wound in the Segmentum Pacificus that had bled cults and corruption into a dozen neighboring systems. Now its spires of blasphemous bone and flesh were collapsing into molten slag under the righteous fury of Voronezov's guns. It was the final name on a list given to his ancestor 10 centuries ago, a list of worlds to purge, a penance to be paid in blood and fire for Vostroya's ancient sin of inaction during the Great Heresy. "Orbital integrity is failing, Lord Marshal," came the vox hiss from his second-in-command, Colonel General Christoph Falk. Falk was a mere 2 centuries old, a youth in Voronezov's eyes, but his command of the 77th Artillery Corps was impeccable. "The traitor fleet is shattered, their planetary shields are gone. We are commencing the final saturation bombardment." Voronezov nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the dying world. "Let the Emperor's light be the last thing this cursed rock ever sees. Let our guns sing the hymn of absolution." He could feel it, a sensation like a loosening of a great chain that had been wrapped around his soul and the souls of his men for generations. 1,000 years of penitence, 1,000 years of sending their firstborn sons to die on forgotten worlds, all to wash away a stain from a time no living man could remember. But the High Lords had promised, purge the list, and Vostroya's honor would be restored. The 77th, this living embodiment of that penance, would finally be allowed to come home. The fleet was a breathtaking sight, a city of steel and fire hanging in the void. 300 capital ships, thousands of escorts, and a swarm of transports that blotted out the stars, each vessel bearing the proud, archaic livery of Vostroya. They were more than an army. They were a nation unto themselves, a nomadic tribe of warriors who had known nothing but the crusade. Their gene stock was pure, their discipline absolute, their faith forged in the crucible of unending war. They were the finest army in the Imperium, and no one was allowed to know it. As the final volley of lance strikes and earthshaker shells ripped the atmosphere from Cordell, a new light blossomed in the void. It was not the angry red of Imperial weapons, but the cold, sharp blue of a Mandeville point rupturing reality. A single vessel emerged, a ship whose design was anathema to the utilitarian brutality of the Imperial Navy. It was a blade of gray and silver, its prow adorned with a single massive icon, a book impaled by a sword. The bridge of the Oath of Stone fell silent. Every officer, every rating, every servitor froze. That sigil was known and feared by all. It was the mark of the Inquisition. Worse, it was the mark of the Ordo Malleus. "Unidentified vessel, this is Lord Marshal Voronezov of the Vostroyan 77th, he broadcasted, his voice a low growl of authority that had cowed planetary governors and chaos lords alike. "You have entered a restricted war zone. State your identity and purpose." The reply came instantly, bypassing all protocols and speaking directly into the command network, a voice that was not sound but a direct psychic imprint. It was cold, precise, and carried an authority that made Voronezov's own seem like a child's boast. "Lord Marshal Voronezov, I am Inquisitor Lord Malachi Crane of the Ordo Malleus. My purpose is you." A palpable chill swept the bridge. The Ordo Malleus did not concern itself with conventional warfare. They were the demon hunters, the watchers of the abyss. For them to arrive here at the very moment of the 77th's triumph was an omen of the darkest kind. Crane's vessel, The sword of Damocles drifted into a high anchor orbit, its weapons cold, its presence more threatening than an entire traitor fleet. Your penitent crusade is concluded, the Inquisitor's voice echoed in their minds. The High Lords acknowledge your service. Your 1,000-year debt is paid. A murmur of relief, a collective exhalation of breath 10 centuries in the holding, went through the bridge crew. Voronezov felt his iron heart stir. It was true. It was over. However, Crane continued, and the chill returned, colder than the void itself. Your service has forged you into a weapon of unique caliber. The Imperium has one final task for the Vostroyan 77th, a task that is not a penance but a reward, a chance to secure a victory so profound it will safeguard 1,000,000 worlds for 10,000 years. Your final honor. Voronezov's hand tightened on the hilt of his ceremonial power saber. He had dealt with Inquisitors before. Their words were traps, their promises poison. A reward from the Ordo Malleus was a concept so alien it bordered on heresy. What is this task, Inquisitor? A world requires pacification. An entity requires caging, the psychic voice stated, devoid of emotion. All records of this campaign are sealed by my authority. Your fleet will disengage from Cordell and set a new course with my astropaths. Your reward, Lord Marshal, is a place in history that will never be recorded, a salvation that will never be known. You will become legends of the shadows. Prepare your men. We make for the Cerberus system. The transmission ended. The Inquisitor's ship remained, a silent silver shark swimming in the black sea of space. On the main view screen, the planet Cordell finally cracked apart, its core exploding in a silent, spectacular puff of superheated gas and vaporized continents. The Vostroyan 77th had won. Their penance was over. But as Voronezov looked from the death of the world he had just conquered to the cold, gray ship of the Ordo Malleus, he felt no triumph. He felt only the icy certainty that their absolution had been a lie, and their true, final damnation was about to begin. The shuttle ride to the Sword of Damocles was a journey from one reality to another. The Vostroyan lander, the Iron Patriarch, was a vessel of rugged opulence, its interior paneled with dark, polished wood from a long-dead world and fitted with brass fixtures tarnished by centuries of service. It smelled of gun oil and cold iron. Lord Marshal Voronezov sat in silence, flanked by Colonel General Falk and 2 of his most senior regimental commanders, all clad in their finest dress uniforms, the medals of 1,000 campaigns gleaming dully in the low light. They were emissaries of a bygone age of warfare, warriors of flesh, bone, and iron resolve. The hangar bay of the inquisitorial cruiser was a stark and sterile void of gray steel and blinding white light. It was silent, save for the hum of impossibly advanced systems and the precise, disciplined footfalls of their escort. There were no deck crews shouting, no clatter of machinery. Servitors, sleek and chrome, where Vostroyan ones were brutal and functional, glided on silent grav units. The very air felt different, scoured clean of history and humanity, tasting of ozone and cold, unyielding purpose. Their escort consisted of a dozen Chaosurcan equivalents, clad in matte black carapace armor, their faces hidden behind mirrored visors, their hellguns held with a stillness that was utterly unnerving. They were led through corridors that were more like surgical incisions in the ship's heart, every surface polished to a mirror sheen, every angle mathematically perfect. The only adornments were inquisitorial sigils, stark and unforgiving. The psychic pressure mounted with every step, a low thrumming at the base of the skull that promised annihilation for a single impure thought. Even Voronezov, whose mind was a fortress built over 10 centuries, felt the probing, insistent presence of a will of unimaginable power. The audience chamber was less a room and more a declaration of absolute authority. It was a hemisphere of obsidian, seemingly without a ceiling, opening into a projected star field so real it felt as though they stood on the edge of the void itself. In the center, upon a dais of tiered silver, sat Inquisitor Lord Malachi Crane. He was ancient, his body little more than a withered husk, sustained by a network of arcane life support systems integrated into his high-collared robes. His face was a pale mask of tightened skin over a skull, but his eyes burned with a cold blue fire that had stared into the heart of the warp and had not blinked. At the foot of his dais, motionless as statues, stood 2 figures that made the Vostroyan commander's blood run cold. They were gray knights, clad in the sacred, unadorned Aegis Terminator armor, their nemesis force halberds humming with contained power. Their presence was a psychic shout, a deafening chorus of purity and righteous hatred that dwarfed even the Inquisitor's oppressive aura. Lord Marshal Voronezov, Crane's voice was not spoken but simply appeared in their minds, a dry rustle of parchment and dust. You have served the Golden Throne with a diligence few in this galaxy can claim. Your penance is complete. Your honor is restored. We have done our duty, as Vostroyans always do, Voronezov stated, his voice the only sound in the chamber, a gravelly rumble of defiance against the crushing silence. We seek only the Emperor's acknowledgement and leave to return our banners to Vostroya. Crane's lips, thin as razor cuts, curled into something that might have been a smile on a human face. The Emperor acknowledges your service by granting you a greater duty, the highest honor, a war that matters more than all the rebellions and Xenos filth you have purged in the last 1,000 years, combined. The Inquisitor gestured with one skeletal, multi-jointed metallic hand, and the star field around them shifted. It focused on a single blighted system, a cancerous mote in the celestial tapestry. This is the Cerberus system, Crane's mental voice explained. Officially, it is listed as a dead zone, forbidden to all stellar traffic. The truth is far worse. Its second planet, Cerberus Secundus, is a prison, and its prisoner is rattling the bars. The image resolved into a vision of the planet. It was not a world of fire and brimstone like so many demon worlds. It was a sphere of sickening, shifting colors, of impossible geometry that hurt the eyes to behold. Continents writhed like living things. Oceans flash froze into crystalline sculptures of screaming faces and then boiled away into vapor in the space of a heartbeat. A demon world, Colonel General Falk stated, his voice tight. We have experience in such matters. We have broken demonic legions on a dozen worlds. We will break them again. One of the gray knights shifted its immense weight, and the sound of the Terminator plate was like a tombstone cracking. Its voice, when it spoke telepathically, was the sound of a tolling iron bell. You have fought the servants. You have never fought the master. Crane raised his hand again. The entity within Cerberus Secundus is no demon of the warp as you understand them. It has no name we can speak, for to name it is to give it purchase. We call it the Silent Annihilator. It is not a creature of chaos, but a sliver of the ultimate void. A conceptual weapon, an echo of a sentience from the dark between galaxies that drifted into our reality and took root in the raw stuff of the Imperium. It does not kill, it does not corrupt, it erases. The vision Crane projected into their minds was not of battle, but of something far more terrifying, a line of Imperial Fist's Terminators standing firm on a barren plain, and then a ripple in the air, a wave of nothing. The Terminators did not fall, did not scream, did not explode. They simply ceased to be, not just their bodies, but the very idea of them. The ground where they stood was smooth, undisturbed. The memories of them in their brothers' minds became blank spaces, moments of confusion and a hollow sense of loss for something they could not name. It unmakes reality. Crane's voice was cold as the grave. It devours existence, leaving not even a memory behind. We, the Ordo Malleus, with the aid of the Sixth Brotherhood, managed to bind it to the planet eons ago. But the cage is failing. Its influence seeps out. A scout fleet that blundered into the system 3 centuries ago was not destroyed. They were unwritten from history. The Astronomicon itself flickers when it gazes upon that sector. If it breaks free, it will not conquer the galaxy. It will delete it, one star system at a time, until only the silence of true nothingness remains. Voronezov stared at the Inquisitor, the full, awful weight of the revelation settling upon him. This was not a war, this was an exorcism on a cosmic scale. Why us, he demanded. This is a task for the Grey Knights, for the full might of the Ordo. The Grey Knights are the scalpel, Lord Marshal. You are the hammer, Crane answered. We have tried surgical strikes. They fail. The entity is woven into the fabric of the planet. To attack it is to attack a concept. It cannot be fought with psychic power or bolter shells alone. But it can be contained. It can be weighted down, anchored by a force of such immense, unshakable belief and material presence that it cannot dematerialize the cage around it. A force of 10 million souls forged in a crucible of penance for a millennium, their discipline absolute, their faith a shield of adamantium. You are not just an army, Lord Marshal. You are a psychic and spiritual anchor of unparalleled density. You are the material from which we will forge a new, permanent lock. The truth was laid bare. It was cold, brutal, and utterly without mercy. They had been chosen for their strength, their faith, and their complete disposability. Their 1,000-year crusade had not been a path to redemption, but a tempering process, turning them into the perfect tool for a task no one else could or would undertake. The promise of returning home was a lie, a carrot dangled to keep them marching towards this final, glorious abattoir. Falk took a half-step forward, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "This is not a reward. This is a death sentence." The second Grey Knight's halberd slammed its butt onto the deck, the crack echoing like a thunderclap. All service to the Emperor is a death sentence. To die in a war that will save all of creation is the greatest reward a mortal can be granted. Voronozov put a hand on Falk's chest, pushing him back. He looked past the Grey Knights, past the withered husk of the Inquisitor, and into the burning blue eyes that held the fate of his 10 million men. There was no negotiation here, no choice. There was only duty, the iron creed that had been beaten into his soul and the soul of every Vostroyan firstborn for 1,000 years. To refuse was to betray everything they were, to render their entire history meaningless. He drew himself up to his full, imposing height, his ornate uniform a stark contrast to the sterile chamber. His voice, when he spoke, was the rumble of mountains moving. The Vostroyan 77th has never failed in its duty to the Emperor. We will not fail now. We accept this honor. Crane gave the slightest of nods, the burning in his eyes momentarily softening into something resembling approval. Good. The fleet of the 77th will be placed under my command. My astropaths will guide you. Rearm, resupply what you can from the spoils of Cordell. We depart in 3 days. As they were escorted from the chamber, back through the cold, silent corridors, Voronozov felt the ghosts of 10 centuries of his ancestors settling upon his shoulders. They had marched towards their absolution. He now had to march his men, their last descendants, towards a damnation that would be called victory. Returning to the familiar, worn interior of the Iron Patriarch, he stood at the viewport, watching the distant burning embers of his final, meaningless victory over Cordell. He keyed the fleet-wide vox, his voice reaching every soldier and officer in the Armada. "This is the Lord Marshal. Our crusade is not over. The Emperor has seen fit to grant us one final glorious task. Set course for the Cerberus system. Our absolution awaits." The journey to the Cerberus system was a silent passage through hell. For 10 centuries, the Vostroyan 77th had plied the treacherous currents of the Imperium, their Geller fields straining against the demonic tides, their navigators bartering pieces of their souls for safe passage. They were accustomed to the whispers in the bulkheads, the fleeting bloody visions in the corner of an eye, the constant grinding pressure on the sanity of every soul aboard. But this journey was different. The fleet, a vast armada of iron and faith, moved through the warp, cocooned in an unnatural stillness. The sword of Damocles and the Grey Knight's strike cruiser, the Argent Shield, projected a psychic cordon around the Vostroyan vessels, a bubble of serene, cold reality in the heart of madness. The whispers ceased. The visions faded. The constant clawing dread was replaced by an empty, sterile silence that was somehow more terrifying. The men grew listless, their faith honed by constant opposition, finding no purchase. It was a becalmed sea of the soul, and the Vostroyans, born for the storm, found it deeply unsettling. Lord Marshal Voronozov stood vigil on his bridge, feeling the change like a drop in atmospheric pressure. This was not the Emperor's peace. It was the calculated, controlled quiet of a vivisection chamber before the first incision is made. He knew they were being preserved, kept fresh and untainted for the slaughter to come. The exit from the warp was not the lurching, violent birth into real space they were accustomed to. It was a smooth, sickening slide, as if reality itself was thin and rotten here. One moment, the swirling, impossible non-colors of the Empyrean filled the observation window. The next, the void. But it was the wrong void. The stars were sharp, hateful pinpricks of icy blue and venomous green. There were no warm yellow suns, no soft nebular clouds. At the system's heart burned a cancerous purple star, Cerberus Prime, which shed light but no warmth. And hanging in the dark, like a diseased pearl, was Cerberus Secundus. All at once, every alarm on the bridge of the Oath of Stone screamed, not the familiar klaxons of enemy contact or shield impacts, but shrill, panicked error runes and warnings of critical system failures. The master chronometer began to cycle randomly, years flickering by in seconds. The navigational cogitators reported their position as simultaneously being at the edge of the system and already plunging into the planet's core. The Auspex arrays showed the fleet as a perfect, pristine formation, and at the same time, as a scattered wreck field of cold, dead hulks. Status report. Voronozov's voice was a sheet of iron, cutting through the rising tide of panic. Lord Marshal, we have no status, Colonel General Falk shouted over the din, his hands flying across a console that was feeding him gibberish. Physics has ceased to be a constant. The laws of nature are suggestions here. Every instrument is lying to us. And then the war against unreality began. The first victim was the Pride of the Oprichnina, a Dauntless-class light cruiser on the fleet's port flank. It fired no warning shots. It suffered no torpedo impacts. It simply, stretched. The vessel, 2 kilometers of adamantium and ceramite, elongated as if viewed through a warped lens, its prow and stern pulling away from its center until it was a thin, shimmering line of metallic light. Then, with a silent, sickening snap, it vanished. No explosion, no debris field, just an empty patch of space where a warship and its 30,000 crew had been moments before. The Vostroyans on nearby ships who witnessed it felt a strange sense of cognitive dissonance, a nagging certainty that the space had always been empty, their minds struggling to hold on to the memory of the ship against a tide of cosmic negation. Before the shock could even register, a wave of shimmering, heatless energy washed through the Vostroyan formation. It was not a blast, but a temporal distortion. The Grand Cruiser Winter's Fang, a veteran of the St. Drusus campaigns, was caught broadside. In the space of 3 heartbeats, the fleet watched in horror as 1,000 years of decay were inflicted upon it. Its iron hull rusted, flaking away into clouds of red dust. Its gun turrets crumbled, its spine buckled, and its reactor core, its containment fields aged to nothing, finally breached. The ship detonated in a slow, silent blossom of fading light, a relic turning to dust. A squadron of Cobra-class destroyers escorting it suffered the opposite fate. They shimmered and seemed to reverse, their forms becoming simpler, more archaic, until they were little more than primitive, ungrafted asteroid miners, their crews devolving into screaming primordial matter before winking out of existence. All ships forward thrust, Voronozov roared, his mind a bastion of cold, hard logic in a universe that had gone insane. Ignore the sensor ghosts, navigate by sight and faith, push through to the designated orbital perimeter. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that to remain static was to be dissected piece by this impossible enemy. Their only hope was to close with the source of the madness, the planet itself. A new horror manifested, a psychic wave, not of rage or fury like a demonic assault, but of pure absolute despair, rolled out from Cerberus Secundus. It was the emotional equivalent of a vacuum. On the bridge of the Oath of Stone, hardened officers who had charged machine gun nests suddenly slumped over their consoles, weeping for no reason they could name. Vox officers babbled nonsense, their minds overloaded with the grief of 1 billion extinct species. A grizzled master-at-arms, a man who had survived 100 boarding actions, drew his last pistol and ended his own life without a sound, a single tear rolling down his cheek. Voronozov felt the wave hit him, an abyss of hopelessness opening in his soul. He saw his 1,000-year crusade not as a triumph of duty, but as a meaningless, bloody waste. He saw Vostroya not as a home to be redeemed, but as a world of sinners who had sent him to die for nothing. The temptation to simply give the order to vent the bridge to the void was overwhelming, a sweet, seductive promise of peace. He snarled, a sound of pure animal fury, and bit down on his own tongue. The sharp, coppery taste of blood was a grounding sensation, a point of pain in reality, in the metaphysical chaos. He focused on the litany of command, the iron words of duty his drill abbot had beaten into him 900 years ago. "Steady!" he bellowed, his voice raw, shaking the crew from their stupor. "Steel your souls! This is but a shadow! The Emperor is our shield! In his name, advance!" The fleet, battered and bleeding ships from its formation, surged forward. They became a spear of iron and fire aimed at the heart of the kaleidoscopic world. Losses were catastrophic. The heavy transport, Serena's burden, carrying 3 full regiments of Vostroyan infantry, 50,000 men, was caught in a spatial fold. Its prow suddenly emerged from its own engine block, the entire vessel turning itself inside out in a grotesque mockery of physics, creating a singularity that devoured 2 of its escorts before it stabilized into a floating sculpture of twisted metal and frozen, screaming crewmen. Yet through it all, 2 ships remained untouched. The sword of Damocles and the argent shield moved with an eerie grace, a bubble of stable reality clinging to their hulls. They were the eye of the storm, the anchor around which the Vostroyan fleet was tearing itself apart. Voronezov understood. They were the shield, the ablative armor of the Ordo Malleus. They were the brute force paving a road of their own corpses so that the Inquisitor's scalpel could reach the patient. Finally, after an eternity of horror, the forward elements of the fleet broke through the last belt of lethal anomalies and achieved a tenuous high orbit over Cerberus Secundus. The chaos subsided. The physics of the immediate orbital space, while still warped, at least became grudgingly consistent. Falk, his face pale and slick with sweat, his uniform singed from an exploding console, turned to the Lord Marshal. "Fleet status. It's a guess, my lord. At least 20% of the fleet is gone. Not destroyed, just gone. We've lost contact with over 30 capital ships. That's nearly 2 million men, vanished without a trace before we've even seen the enemy." Voronezov stared down at the world below. It was a swirling nightmare of colors and shapes, a living insult to creation. His fleet was shattered, his men's sanity was frayed, and the real battle had not even begun. But they had made it. They had paid the price in blood and steel and souls, and they had reached the shore of this impossible war. "Then 2 million souls have made their final payment for Vostroya's honor," Voronezov said, his voice cold as the void. "Sound the call to arms. Prepare the landing craft. We have bought this ground with the best of us. Now we will sanctify it with the rest." The plan, when it came from Inquisitor Crane, was one of brutal, almost contemptuous simplicity. There would be no surgical strikes, no reconnaissance in force, no feints or flanking maneuvers. Such tactics were for wars fought in a rational universe. Cerberus Secundus was not a strategic challenge. It was a conceptual one. The Vostroyan 77th would not outmaneuver it. They would crush it under the weight of their own reality. "You will descend in a single simultaneous wave," Crane's psychic voice had echoed in the minds of Voronezov and his command staff, gathered in the strategy theater of the Oath of Stone. A holographic image of the writhing planet dominated the room. "Every lander, every transport, every gun cutter and heavy lifter will make for the surface at once. You will not target military installations, for there are none. You will target the largest, most stable-seeming landmass, and you will land upon it, or you will crash upon it. The distinction is irrelevant. You are not an army making an amphibious assault. You are a meteor strike of faith and iron, intended to fracture the very consciousness of the world you are invading." It was a plan that could only have been conceived by a mind that viewed 10 million soldiers not as men but as ammunition. The objective was to force a beachhead, a zone of imperial reality, onto the planet's surface through the sheer, undeniable mass of the Vostroyan presence. They would be the anchor, and their landing craft were the first links in the chain. The embarkation was a silent, solemn affair, conducted with the grim efficiency of 10 centuries of war. Across the surviving ships of the fleet, millions of men in greatcoats and tall fur hats marched in perfect discipline into the cavernous holds of the landers. They filed past chaplains who anointed their laze guns with sacred oils and commissars whose eyes were chips of granite. There were no rousing speeches, no cries of "for the Emperor." Their entire existence was a prayer to the God Emperor of mankind. No further words were needed. They were the firstborn of Vostroya, and they knew their duty. They were born to die in the Emperor's name on a world they had never seen, and this was simply the day their purpose would be fulfilled. Voronezov stood on the command deck of his personal landing craft, the Iron Citadel. It was less a ship and more a flying fortress, a relic from the dark age of technology, a squat, brutalist ziggurat of adamantium plating and void shield generators. Within its belly resided his entire command staff, the Legion's Primaris Psychers, and a full regiment of his own household guard, the Voronezov Iron Spire Guard. As the final checks were completed, he looked out of the thick armaglass viewport at the swarm of craft assembling around him. Thousands upon thousands of them, from the colossal Leviathan transports, capable of carrying a dozen super-heavy tanks, to the innumerable smaller craft, each one a brick and bay, the wall of faith they were about to hurl at the enemy. All craft report green for descent, came the vox hiss from Falk, strapped into a command throne opposite him. The Grey Knights have begun their own insertion. They are targeting a psychic vortex at the northern pole. They will be our anvil. We are the hammer. Voronezov gave a curt nod. Let the hammer fall. The descent began. A rain of iron coffins, 10,000 strong, plummeted from orbit into the swirling, kaleidoscopic atmosphere of Cerberus Secundus. The initial entry was deceptively calm. The air, a shimmering miasma of impossible colors, offered little resistance. And then the planet woke up, and the true war began. The first wave of attacks was sensory. The viewports became a screaming chaos of light and pattern that bypassed the optic nerves and burned directly into the brain, causing pilots to seize and navigators to claw at their own eyes. A cacophony of sound, the wails of 1 trillion tortured souls, hammered at the hulls, transmitted through the very structure of the ships to vibrate the bones of the men inside into dust. On the iron citadel, Voronezov's psychers screamed as one, blood pouring from their eyes and ears as they formed a psychic shield, a fragile bubble of sanity against the onslaught. Ignore the sensorium. Descend on inertial guidance alone. Voronezov's command cut through the mental chaos. He was a rock in a sea of madness, his will a singular point of focus for the entire formation. The planet's defense shifted. Gravity itself became a weapon. A squadron of Orca-class landers to the starboard was suddenly crushed, flattened into two-dimensional shapes as the local gravitational force multiplied 1,000-fold. Another group was flung violently back up into the high atmosphere as their patch of space became a gravity inversion well. The iron citadel groaned, its ancient frame complaining as its internal compensators fought a losing battle against the constantly shifting pull. Men were slammed into ceilings and then crushed into the floor plating, their bones turned to jelly. "Power to the engines! Brute force it!" Falk yelled, his knuckles white on his console. They pushed deeper. Now the planet began to play with time. A Gorgon assault transport, its forward ramp already packed with Rough Riders mounted on their cybernetically enhanced steeds, flashed with a silver light. It aged 10,000 years in a second, its hull corroding to lace, its crew and passengers to skeletons before it disintegrated. Not 100 meters away, a sister ship was caught in a reverse current and de-aged, its advanced systems reverting to cog and steam power before the entire vessel turned into a lump of unrefined iron ore that tumbled uselessly through the sky. The Vostroyan response was as simple and brutal as their orders. They fired their weapons, not at targets, but at the sky itself. Lascannons, multi-lasers, and autocannons spewed a constant stream of energy and explosive shells into the atmosphere ahead of them, a flak barrage against reality itself. The sheer energy discharge seemed to momentarily stabilize the physics around them, carving a corridor of normality through the madness. They were not dodging the storm. They were blasting their way through it, sanctifying the very air with their own atomized ordnance. Voronezov watched the casualty count climb on his master display. 30%, 40, 50. The numbers were meaningless abstractions for the horror unfolding outside. He saw the Patriarch's fist, a lander carrying 1,000 men of the 501st Line Infantry, suddenly fold in on itself, its four corners meeting in the middle to become a perfect spinning cube of crushed metal before it vanished. He heard the final, terrified screams of the commander of the 114th Armored Fist as his Lehman Russ tanks, chained down in the hold of their Leviathan, were transmuted into writhing, fleshy abominations that devoured the crew. Through it all, he remained impassive, his will the spine of the invasion. His orders were calm, precise, and unwavering. Reroute power, tighten formation, maintain firing vectors. He was the eye of a hurricane of his own making. With a final bone-jarring shudder, the iron citadel broke through the last atmospheric layer. The ground rushed up to meet them. It was a landscape of bruised purple rock and rivers of viscous silver fluid that seemed to flow uphill. Jagged mountains of black crystal scraped at a sky of churning, oily green. The landing zone was a plateau of relatively stable-looking obsidian. There was no finesse. The landing craft of the Vostroyan 77th did not touch down. They impacted. All across the plateau, for 100 kilometers in every direction, the survivors of the descent crashed into the alien surface. Hulls buckled, landing struts sheared off, engines exploded. It was less a landing and more a controlled plane crash involving an entire army. The iron citadel slammed into the ground with the force of an earthquake, its immense bulk carving a kilometer-long trench in the obsidian before screeching to a halt, its forward third buried in the alien geology. The silence that followed was broken by the shriek of tortured metal and the booming of massive assault ramps being blasted open. From the wreckage of 1,000 crashed vessels, the Vostroyan firstborn emerged. They moved with purpose, ignoring the groaning metal of their shattered transports and the impossible landscape around them. They formed ranks. Heavy weapons teams set up their mortars and lascannons. Lehman Russ battle tanks, their engines roaring in defiance of the alien air, rolled down buckled ramps and established a perimeter. Lord Marshal Voronezov stood on the forward ramp of the iron citadel, the green, sickly light of the sky glinting off his carapace armor. The air tasted of sulfur and regret. All around him, his army, or what was left of it, was creating a pocket of imperial order in a universe of pure chaos. Less than half of the men who had begun the descent now stood on the surface of Cerberus Secundus. 5 million souls had been the price of this beachhead. He drew his power saber, its energy field humming a low, angry song, and plunged it into the obsidian ground. He then took the Legion's grand standard from a waiting bearer, a great eagle of Vostroya clutching a lightning bolt, and planted it firmly beside the sword. "The 77th has made planetfall," he broadcasted on a secure command channel that crackled with atmospheric interference. "The iron landing is complete. We hold the ground." But as he stared out at the horizon, where the very landscape seemed to be watching them, he knew they did not hold the ground. They were merely a fresh stain upon it, a morsel that had just landed on the tongue of a hungry and malevolent god. The beachhead, christened Voronezov's Hope, in a grim jest by the command staff, was an island of martial order in an ocean of insanity. For 100 square kilometers, the Vostroyan 77th imposed their reality upon Cerberus Secundus. The ground was leveled by earth movers and sanctified by platoons of priests chanting litanies of faith. Prefabricated fortifications dragged from the bellies of shattered leviathans were erected in precise overlapping fields of fire. Vox towers, their signals tenuous and constantly threatening to dissolve into screams, rose like skeletal fingers pointing at the hateful green sky. The army was a machine, and even amidst the wreckage of their landing, its gears began to turn with inexorable, disciplined force. But the true linchpin of the invasion was not the fortifications or the tanks. It was the indomitable will of one man. Lord Marshal Evgeny Voronezov was more than a commander. He was the psychic and spiritual center of gravity for his entire army. In a realm where belief could literally shape reality, his unwavering faith and utter refusal to yield were the bedrock upon which the entire imperial presence was built. While other men saw their sanity shredded by the impossible geometry and whispering winds, Voronezov saw only terrain to be conquered and an enemy to be broken. He established his command post not in the relative safety of the buried iron citadel, but in a hastily erected command bunker on the forward edge of the perimeter, a position the men had dubbed the Bulwark of Defiance. From there, he directed the war, his presence a constant reassuring beacon to his troops. He walked the trench lines daily, his greatcoat billowing behind him, his scarred face set in a permanent scowl of grim determination. He would stop to speak with the heavy weapons team, his voice a low rumble that cut through the constant, maddening hum of the planet. He would adjust the aim of a basilisk's earthshaker cannon himself, sighting down the barrel not at a grid coordinate, but at a distant crystalline forest that wept tears of molten glass. He shared rations of cold grok stew with infantrymen in their foxholes, his silence more comforting than any commissar's empty platitudes. The soldiers revered him. He was a living legend, an ancestral figure who had commanded their great-great-grandfathers. They did not see a man, but the embodiment of Vostroya itself, stubborn, resilient, and utterly uncompromising. When a squad's lasguns began to melt into whimpering, fleshy tubes, it was the sight of the Lord Marshal calmly drawing his own archaic las pistol and blasting the abomination that restored their resolve. When the very ground beneath the platoon's feet turned to quicksand made of forgotten memories, it was Voronezov's bellowed order to stand firm on the honor of your ancestors, Vyepeyets, that gave them the spiritual strength to resist being pulled under. The planet fought back, not with armies, but with insidious targeted assaults on their reality. Rivers of liquid despair would flow towards the Imperial lines, and where they touched the trenches, men would simply lose the will to live, their bodies remaining on guard while their souls evaporated. Voronezov countered this by ordering the Legion's priests to bless the primary water supplies and have the engineers pipe this holy water into the trenches, creating a literal mote of faith that caused the rivers of sorrow to recoil in steam. Shifting kaleidoscopic mirages of Vostroya would appear on the horizon, perfect in every detail, showing their homes, their families, and a world at peace. The longing it induced was a physical pain, a siren's call to abandon the fight and walk out into the hallucinatory embrace. Voronezov's response was brutal and effective. He ordered the artillery to shell the mirages. The sight of their beloved homeworld being shattered by their own Earthshaker rounds was a horrifying but necessary inoculation against the planet's psychological warfare. It was a declaration. There was no home to return to. There was only the war. His greatest test came during the assault on the Weeping Peaks, a range of jagged black mountains that seemed to be the source of much of the planet's psychic miasma. The 33rd Vostroyan Line infantry, tasked with securing a high pass, suddenly went silent. Voronezov, fearing the worst, mounted his personal command variant of the Macarius Vanquisher, the Will of Iron, and led a relief column of Lehman Russ tanks into the mountains himself. What he found was not a scene of battle, but one of absolute terrifying stillness. The entire regiment, 5,000 men, were frozen in place like statues of gray stone. They were not dead, but trapped, each man locked in a personal temporal stasis, forced to endlessly relive the single worst moment of his life. One soldier was forever dropping his rifle during his first inspection, the shame on his face eternal. A hardened veteran was trapped in the moment his best friend died in his arms, on a world 100 light years and 5 centuries away. The air crackled with chronometric energy. The Will of Iron's own systems began to slow, its turrets struggling to turn as if moving through thick tar. Voronezov felt the effect trying to take him, the ghosts of his own 1,000 years of failure and loss rising up to claim him. He saw his first command, a disastrous charge on the world of Orestes V, where he had lost half his men to a poorly scouted minefield. He felt the cold dread of receiving the news that his own son, serving in a different segmentum, had been killed in action 3 centuries prior. Gritting his teeth until his jaw ached, he fought back. He did not deny the memories. He did not try to suppress the pain. He accepted it. He owned it. He took the sum of his millennium of grief and forged it into a weapon. "Pain is a memory. Grief is a luxury," he roared, his voice broadcast through the tank's external voxcasters, a raw, powerful sound that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the temporal field. "We are Vostroyan. We are defined not by our failures, but by the duty that bids us rise from them. Your service is not over. I command you to advance." He pushed open the commander's hatch and stood exposed to the chronometric storm, a giant in dark armor. He drew his power saber, its blade a searing blue in the green gloom. He focused his will, the sheer, obstinate, grinding force of his belief in the Imperium, in his duty, in the ironclad code of the Vostroyan firstborn, and projected it outwards. It was not the elegant psychic lance of a librarian, but a battering ram of pure, unadulterated human stubbornness. A tremor ran through the frozen soldiers. One by one, with the agonizing slowness of glaciers moving, they began to break free. A finger twitched, an eye blinked. A man screamed, the sound distorted as it caught up with the present. The temporal field, unable to find purchase in men whose commander had ordered them to simply ignore their own past, began to collapse. Within an hour, the entire regiment was moving again, shaken and scarred by their experience, but their discipline restored by the sheer, undeniable presence of their Lord Marshal. He had not fought the planet with magic or technology, but with the simple, brutal arithmetic of a soldier's duty. The legend of Voronezov's defiance spread through the army like wildfire. He was no longer just a commander. He was the Emperor's will made manifest, a bulwark of reality against the tide of the unreal. He led his legions out from the beachhead, a slow, grinding advance across continents of crystalline sorrow and over rivers of forgotten memories. Every meter gained was paid for in souls, but under Voronozov's unwavering gaze, the Vostroyan 77th did not just advance. They crushed the impossible beneath the treads of their tanks and the heels of their boots, forging a new, grimmer reality in their wake. He was a force of nature in his own right, a figure of iron will in a war against insanity itself. For months, the war had been a grinding, attritional advance against a passive yet lethal environment. The Vostroyan 77th had grown accustomed to the planet's insidious assaults, the temporal distortions, the psychic miasmas, the transmutative geography. They had learned to counter them with faith, discipline, and overwhelming firepower. Their progress was slow, a creeping stain of imperial order spreading across the alien world, but it was progress nonetheless. Lord Marshal Voronozov had established a series of fortified lines, each one a testament to Vostroyan grit, pushing ever closer to the psychic epicenter of the world, a pulsating shadowy depression on their long-range augurs that the Grey Knights had designated the core anomaly. The cost was immense, with entire companies vanishing into sudden spatial rifts or being driven mad by whispering winds, but the army's momentum seemed unbreakable. They were wrong. They had mistaken the planet's passive defenses for the full extent of its power. They had been fighting the cage, not the prisoner, and now the prisoner had begun to stir. The first indication was not a grand offensive, but a subtle, pervasive change. A silence, the constant, maddening psychic hum that permeated Cerberus Secundus, the background noise of insanity to which the soldiers had become grimly accustomed, began to fade. At first it was a relief, a blessed quiet in a universe of noise. Men on the front lines looked at each other with dawning hope. Chaplains gave thanks for what they perceived as a weakening of the enemy's influence. Only Voronozov, standing on the observation deck of his forward command fortress, felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. This was not peace, it was the deep, indrawn breath before a scream. The whisper of annihilation began at the front line of the 4th Army Corps, who were pushing through a valley of singing crystalline flora. It was not a sound nor a psychic attack. It was a presence, a wave of profound, absolute nothingness that rolled out from the direction of the core anomaly. It was the antithesis of existence, a concept so alien and abhorrent to the Militarum that it defied description. Sergeant Kostian of the 401st Vostroyan Grenadiers was the first to experience it. One moment he was directing his squad's heavy bolter placement, the air filled with the familiar curses of his men and the chime of the crystal plants. The next, a ripple like heat haze washed over his position. Private Alexander, a young trooper fresh from the Skola on Vostroya Prime, was standing not 5 feet from him. The ripple passed over Alexander, and he was simply not. He did not die. He did not scream. There was no flash of light or puff of smoke. His existence was canceled. The space he had occupied was now filled with the silent, chiming air of the valley. Kostian blinked. He felt a sudden, jarring sense of confusion. His squad felt incomplete. He had been speaking to someone. He was sure of it. He looked around, a nagging void in his short-term memory. He checked his data slate. It listed 9 men in his squad. He counted them. There were only 8. He frowned, a cold sweat breaking out on his brow. The data slate must be wrong. It had to be. The ripple continued, a slow, silent tide of unbeing washing through the Vostroyan lines. It was not an attack that could be fought. Aegis armor and faith were shields against energy and demons, but they offered no protection against ontological erasure. A Lehman Russ demolisher, the Emperor's Fury, was caught in the wave. Its massive siege cannon did not melt or explode. It simply ceased to have ever been forged, leaving the turret with a perfectly smooth, sealed hole where it had been. The crew inside stared in dumbfounded horror at a solid block of plasteel where their weapon controls used to be, the memory of the cannon fading from their minds like a half-remembered dream. Panic, for the first time in the campaign, began to take hold. This was a terror beyond the comprehension of soldiers trained to fight tangible foes. How could you fight an enemy that defeated you by making it so you had never existed at all? Regiments began to fall back in disarray, not from an enemy they could see, but from patches of empty air that their deepest instincts screamed was fundamentally wrong. On the bridge of the Oath of Stone, in high orbit, the strategic displays turned to chaos. Entire battalions were vanishing from the map, not marked as destroyed, but simply disappearing, leaving gaps in the Imperial lines. Vox transmissions from the front became hysterical. Squad 7 is gone. No, wait. Was there a Squad 7? I can't remember. Emperor's Mercy. What was I saying? Voronezov, at his bulwark of defiance, watched the wave of nothingness approach. He could see it now, a faint shimmering in the air, a distortion that made the distant mountains seem to waver. It was slow, patient, and utterly inexorable. He felt the cold touch of it on his mind, a seductive whisper that promised an end to his 1,000 years of weariness. It did not offer death, but a peace far more profound, the peace of never having been born, of never having had to carry the burden of duty, honor, and loss. It promised to erase his sins and his victories alike, to wipe the slate of his soul utterly clean. "Artillery!" he roared into his command vox, his voice a defiant anchor of reality. "All batteries, fire mission extremists, target grid 00 Alpha, fire at the empty air, drown the silence and fire an iron." Across the 100-kilometer front, the Vostroyan guns roared as one. Basilisks, medusas, and manticores unleashed a biblical storm of high explosives. The shells screamed into the valley, detonating not on a visible enemy, but in the path of the encroaching void. The effect was immediate and shocking. Where the explosions ripped apart the fabric of the material world, the wave of nothingness seemed to fray. The explosions themselves were snuffed out mid-detonation, their fire and fury unmade in an instant, but their sheer violent intrusion into the materium seemed to disrupt the Annihilator's focus. The silent tide faltered, its advance slowing, the shimmering in the air growing less distinct. It was not a victory, but a reprieve. The Vostroyans had discovered that they could not harm the entity, but they could distract it. They could anchor reality with such a volume of physical violence that it became too loud for the whisper of the void to find purchase. A new, terrifying strategy was born of this desperation. The Vostroyan 77th ceased their advance. Their war was no longer one of conquest, but of noise. They turned their entire beachhead into a constant rolling bombardment. Artillery fired ceaselessly, not at targets, but at pre-designated anchoring fields ahead of their lines. Infantry poured last fire into empty ground. Tanks fired their main cannons at hills that had done nothing to offend them. They created a perimeter of pure, meaningless violence, a buffer zone of chaos and fire that kept the silent nothingness at bay. The cost of this new strategy was astronomical. Barrels melted, ammunition supplies dwindled at an alarming rate, and the psychological toll on the men, forced to participate in this seemingly insane, constant barrage against a non-existent foe, was immense. They were holding the line, but they were trapped, pinned down by an enemy they couldn't see, fighting a war against a concept. They had silenced the whisper of annihilation, but in its place, they had created a deafening roar of their own making, and Voronezov knew, with chilling certainty, that they could not maintain this cacophony forever. The silence was patient. It only had to wait for their guns to fall quiet. The revelation did not come in a grand conclave or a strategic briefing. It came in the heart of the cacophony, a moment of dreadful clarity amidst the ceaseless roar of the Vostroyan guns. For 3 weeks, the army had maintained its barrage of being, a constant rolling bombardment that kept the creeping nihilism of the silent annihilator at bay. They had created a wall of sound and fury, a buffer of violent reality, but it was a finite solution to an infinite problem. Ammunition was a resource, and it was bleeding away. More than that, the souls of the men were fraying, their discipline eroded by a war against an enemy they could not see, fought for a reason they could no longer comprehend. Lord Marshal Voronezov stood with Inquisitor Crane on a high gantry overlooking the main ordnance depot. Below them, thousands of servitors and ratings worked in a frantic, ceaseless ballet, loading shells onto grav sleds that sped towards the ever-hungry guns at the front. The air was thick with cordite fumes and the shuddering thunder of the nearby artillery pits. Crane had descended from his silent vessel, his withered form carried on a suspensor throne, accompanied by the 2 colossal Grey Knight Terminators. His presence among the Vostroyan lines was a rare and ominous event. "Your strategy is crude, Lord Marshal, but effective for a time," Crane's voice echoed in Voronezov's mind, a dry rustle against the thunder of the guns. "But you are burning your army to fuel a bonfire. You cannot sustain this. The silence is patient. It will outlast your shells. Then give me a better solution, Inquisitor, Voronozov growled, not turning to look at the ancient figure. His gaze was fixed on the shimmering curtain of distorted air that marked the edge of their precarious reality miles away. My men are dying to buy you time. What is the great and terrible purpose of the Ordo Malleus in this? Where is your arcane weapon, your master stroke? The Inquisitor was silent for a long moment, the blue fires in his eye sockets seeming to dim. There is no weapon that can destroy a concept. There is no blade that can cut nothingness. You speak of this entity as a prisoner in a cage. That metaphor is flawed. You cannot cage the wind, but you can build up a wall so high and so solid that the wind cannot pass. It was one of the Grey Knights who finally spoke, his voice a tolling bell of grim finality that cut through all other sound. His name, Voronozov had learned, was Brother Captain Arian. The Lord Inquisitor's metaphor is also incomplete. This is not a wind, it is a vacuum. To stop it, you cannot build a wall. You must fill the space with something so dense, so absolute, that the vacuum has no place to form. Arian raised a gauntlet, pointing not at the shimmering front, but at the Vostroyan soldiers working below. The mission was never to conquer this world, Lord Marshal. It was to become it. You are not the army of liberation. You are the material for this cage. The awful truth, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, pierced the layers of Voronozov's iron will. He turned slowly to face the Inquisitor, the roar of the guns fading to a distant hum. He saw it all in that moment, the 1,000-year crusade that was not a penance but a tempering, the selection of his army not for its strength but for its spiritual density, the lies about honor and reward. Explain. Voronozov's voice was dangerously quiet, a low tremor that promised violence. The silent annihilator erases existence. It feeds on emptiness, Crane elaborated, his tone devoid of pity or malice. It was the detached voice of a chirurgeon explaining a necessary amputation, but it struggles against that which is possessed of a powerful, undeniable reality. A soul, forged in duty and faith, is such a thing. A single soul is a candle flame against its hurricane. But 10 million souls unified in purpose, tempered by a millennium of sacrifice, their discipline absolute, such a force possesses a spiritual mass, a reality density that is almost incomprehensible. What you are, Brother Captain Arian continued, his helmet's impassive faceplate seeming to judge Voronozov and find him wanting, is the ultimate anchor. The entity is bound to the geophysical form of this planet. To contain it, we must transform the planet itself. We must overwrite its chaotic, unstable nature with a new, permanent reality, your reality. The full, monstrous scope of their reward was laid bare. They were not here to win a war. They were the raw material for a cosmic ritual of binding. Their souls were to be the bricks, their collective will the mortar, their shared history and honor the foundation of a planet-sized prison. You mean to kill us all, Voronozov stated, the words tasting like ash. To sacrifice my entire army. Sacrifice implies a choice and an end, Crane corrected him, the distinction chillingly precise. Your men will not die. Death is a form of erasure, a cessation of being. We cannot afford that. No, your souls will be permanently bonded to the metaphysical structure of Cerberus Secundus. You will be woven into its very essence. Your consciousness is locked in an eternal, unwavering vigil. You will become the wardens. You will become the walls. You will be immortal, Lord Marshal. Your duty will never, ever end. Colonel General Falk, who had been standing silently behind Voronozov, finally broke. This is heresy, madness, to use the souls of the Emperor's faithful as building materials. We are Vostroyan firstborn, not psychic putty. He reached for his bolt pistol, his face a mask of rage and betrayal. The second Grey Knight, who had not moved or spoken, shifted its weight. The air grew thick and heavy. Falk froze, his hand hovering over his holster, a look of pure terror on his face, as the knight's psychic presence crushed his defiance before it could even begin. There is no heresy in victory, Colonel General, Crane said softly. There is no damnation in service that saves a million worlds. The Imperium has asked for your lives on countless battlefields, and you have given them gladly, Today, the Emperor asks for your souls. Is the price suddenly too high? Voronozov looked from the Inquisitor's withered face to the impassive helmets of the Grey Knights. He saw no room for negotiation, no glimmer of hope for an alternative. This had been the plan from the moment his fleet had been diverted from their triumphant return. They had been marching to their own damnation, draped in the banners of honor. The choice they had been given was a lie. The only choice left was how they would face their fate. He turned his back on the Inquisitor and looked out once more at his army. He saw the gunners, their faces black with soot, their bodies aching, still serving their weapons. He saw the infantry, standing their watch in trenches carved from insane geology. He saw the banners of Vostroyan, tattered by 1,000 years of war, still flying in the hateful green sky. They were his men, his responsibility. He had led them here, to this final, unthinkable precipice. "And if we refuse?" Voronozov asked, his voice hollow. "Then we will leave," Crane replied simply. "We will quarantine this system and let the silent annihilator consume your army. When your last shell is fired and the silence takes you, the entity will be stronger for having consumed so many powerful souls. Its escape will be that much quicker. Your sacrifice will have been meaningless, and your dishonor absolute. The choice, as it has always been, is yours, Lord Marshal. Damnation in service or annihilation in failure." The ceaseless, defiant roar of the Vostroyan guns was the only answer. The guns fell silent. The abrupt cessation of the constant, rolling thunder was more shocking than the loudest explosion. For weeks, the cacophony had been their shield, the violent rhythm of their existence. Now, an unnatural quiet descended upon the Vostroyan lines, a silence so profound it felt like a physical pressure on the eardrums. In the distance, the shimmering curtain of the silent annihilator's influence seemed to pulse, to swell, as if sensing the sudden vulnerability. The soldiers gripped their laser guns, their knuckles white, their eyes wide with the terror that no commissar's threat could quell. They were naked before the void. Lord Marshal Voronozov had made his choice. The news had been delivered not through a grand proclamation, but through the chain of command, a quiet, grim dissemination of their ultimate fate. There were no riots. There was no mass panic. There were sporadic, isolated suicides, men who could not face the prospect of an eternity as a living stone. There were commissars who, unable to reconcile this order with their rigid ideology, executed themselves for the heresy of their own confusion. But the army, as a whole, held 10 centuries of absolute discipline, of unquestioning obedience to their Lord Marshal, had forged their souls into something that could bend under this impossible weight, but would not break. They were Vostroyans. They had been given an order. It was their duty to obey, even if that order was to march into their own damnation. The price of redemption, as Inquisitor Crane had called it, was to be paid not in blood, but in consciousness. Voronozov stood before the assembled regimental commanders in the primary briefing chamber of the shattered iron citadel. The holographic display in the center of the room no longer showed casualty reports or strategic objectives. It showed a map of their own souls, a diagram of the great ritual that would be their final act of war. "The Inquisitor has named our fate," Voronozov began, his voice devoid of its usual fire. It was the flat, weary tone of a man who had already seen the end of all things. "We are to become the substance of the ward. Our souls, our very beings, will be woven into this planet to create a cage of permanent reality. We will not die, we will endure. Our vigil will be eternal, our service unending." He let the words hang in the silent room. He saw the flicker of horror, of disbelief, of dawning, awful acceptance in the eyes of his officers, men who had followed him across the galaxy, who had charged demons at his side. "This is not a reward," he continued, his voice hardening with the flicker of the old iron. "It is a curse. It is the most monstrous duty ever levied upon a servant of the Emperor. But it is a duty nonetheless. Our ancestors failed the Imperium once. For 1,000 years we have paid that debt with the blood of our sons. Now we are asked to pay the final coin. To refuse is to render that entire millennium of sacrifice meaningless. It is to let this entity break free and unmake everything our comrades have ever died to protect. I will not lead the Vostroyan 77th to dishonor, not at the end." He paused, his gaze sweeping over each man. "There will be no retreat. There is no escape. There is only the choice of how we meet this end. as a broken, terrified mob consumed by the void, or as the Vostroyan firstborn, disciplined and defiant to the last, forging our own damnation into the greatest victory in the history of this segmentum. His words, stark and brutal, settled over them. They were not words of inspiration, but of grim necessity. They were the final turn of a key in a lock that had been closing for 10 centuries. Colonel General Falk, his face pale and drawn, stepped forward. His earlier rage had been replaced by a hollow, chilling calm. "What are your orders, Lord Marshal?" Voronozov turned to the holographic map. 5 points on the planet's surface glowed with an angry red light. They were scattered across the continent, located in places of extreme metaphysical instability, a chasm where gravity flowed like water, a forest of whispering glass, a frozen volcano that erupted with solid shadows. "These are the Loki," Voronozov announced, his voice regaining its familiar command authority. 5 metaphysical anchor points. The Grey Knights are already moving to secure the primary nexus at the pole. We must seize the other 4. The ritual of binding must be grounded at these locations. It is here that our souls will be forged into the planet's substance. He looked at his commanders. This will be our final offensive. A full-scale, simultaneous assault on all 4 objectives. We will throw every man, every tank, every gun we have left into this attack. We will expend ourselves completely. The price of reaching these locations will be catastrophic. The planet will resist us with every tool of insanity it possesses. We will not be fighting for ground. We will be fighting for the right to perform our own execution. The grim reality of the plan settled in. They were being asked to launch a suicide mission on a continental scale, with the objective being not victory, but the successful completion of their own eternal imprisonment. It was an order of such profound, tragic irony that only the grimdark theater of the 41st millennium could have conceived it. Regiments will be assigned their objectives, Voronozov continued, the familiar cadence of battle orders a strange comfort in the face of the unthinkable. The 4th and 9th Army Corps will advance on Locus Alpha, the chasm of ungravity. The 2nd Armored Legion will spearhead the assault on Locus Beta, the glass forest. The 11th Siege Army and the 21st Line Infantry will take the shadow volcano, Locus Gamma. I will personally lead the 1st Army Corps, my own Iron Spire Guard, to the final and most heavily defended point, Locus Delta, the Cathedral of Forgotten Echoes. He deactivated the map. The room was plunged into the dim, green emergency lighting. This is our last march, our last battle. It is the culmination of our 1,000-year penance. Let us show the galaxy how the Vostroyan firstborn pay their debts, in full and without flinching. There were no cheers, no battle cries, just a series of grim, determined nods. The commanders filed out of the room, their faces set like stone, to deliver the final orders to their men. They would march, they would fight, they would die, and then their service would truly begin. Voronozov remained alone in the chamber, the weight of 10 million souls settling onto his shoulders. He was asking his men to embrace a fate worse than death, to trade oblivion for an eternity of silent, conscious imprisonment. He was leading them to a victory that was indistinguishable from a curse. It was the price of redemption, and it was a price that would leave nothing of them but legends of iron and silence, a debt paid with the very currency of their souls. The final offensive of the Vostroyan 77th began not with a roar of artillery, but with the solemn tolling of bells. Across the beachhead, priests in gore-stained robes swung heavy iron censers, and from the vox casters of every command post and chimera, the sound of Vostroya's ancient mournful hymns of duty echoed across the alien landscape. It was a dirge for an army that was already marching to its grave. 10 million men, what remained of them, began to move as one, a vast, grinding machine of flesh and steel, leaving the relative sanity of their fortified lines to plunge into the heart of the planet's madness. This was not a war of territory, but an act of will. The planet, sensing the army's ultimate purpose, resisted with a fury that dwarfed all its previous efforts. The march to the Lotsi was a pilgrimage through a hell that defied all physical laws. The 4th and 9th Army Corps, advancing on the chasm of ungravity, found themselves in a nightmare of shifting physics. The ground itself became a treacherous enemy, Entire platoons were flung screaming into the sickly green sky as patches of earth reversed their polarity. Lehman Russ tanks weighing 60 tons suddenly became lighter than air, tumbling end over end until their crews were pulp, while others became so heavy they sank into the solid rock as if it were mud. The chasm itself was a wound in reality, a colossal canyon where gravity flowed in visible, shimmering rivers. To cross it, the Vostroyan engineers had to construct bridges of pure faith, sanctified girders and plates that were held together not by rivets, but by the ceaseless chanted litanies of the priests who accompanied them. Men fell not to enemy fire, but to a moment's doubt, their loss of conviction causing the very ground beneath their feet to betray them. Towards the glass forest, the Second Armored Legion faced a foe that attacked the mind. The crystalline trees sang a song of perfect, sorrowful beauty, a lament that resonated with every loss and failure a soldier had ever experienced. Tank commanders wept openly as they relived the deaths of old comrades, their grief so profound they forgot how to fight. The whispers of the forest promised an end to pain, a gentle dissolution into the crystal, to become one with the beautiful sadness. The Legion's commissars were forced into a brutal, heartbreaking duty, executing not cowards but heroes, who had been broken by a weaponized sense of empathy. The only way forward was to shatter the forest, the tanks advancing behind a rolling barrage of earthshaker shells that turned the source of the beautiful, deadly music into fields of sharp, silent splinters. The assault on the shadow volcano was a descent into a literal heart of darkness. The mountain erupted not with lava, but with billowing clouds of solid, tangible darkness, a physical manifestation of fear. Where the shadows fell, they did not just obscure light, they erased it, creating zones of absolute blindness where a man could not see his own hand in front of his face. Worse, the shadows carried the essence of dread. Soldiers caught in them were overwhelmed by their deepest, most primal terrors. They fought phantoms born of their own minds, demons, monstrous xenos, the accusing faces of the dead. It became a chaotic, internecine brawl as squads fired blindly into the dark, killing their own comrades in their terror. The advance only succeeded because the Vostroyans of the 11th Siege Army were masters of the trench. They advanced by digging, carving covered tunnels through the obsidian plains, creating their own narrow, controllable lines of sight, pushing forward meter by bloody meter, a subterranean invasion against an enemy made of pure fear. But the most brutal fighting was reserved for the 1st Army Corps, led by Lord Marshal Voronozov himself, as they marched on the Cathedral of Forgotten Echoes. This locus was a colossal crystalline structure that pulsed with a faint internal light, a place where the silent annihilator's power to erase memory was concentrated. The entity did not send monsters or demons. It sent ghosts, not the spirits of the dead, but the echoes of things that had been unmade. As they approached, Voronozov and his men found themselves fighting alongside spectral warriors, legions of thunder warriors from the Unification Wars, their armor archaic and brutal, charged foes only they could see. Squads of Imperial fists in the black and yellow of the Great Crusade appeared, exchanging grim nods with the Vostroyans before vanishing. It was a battle against history itself, a confusing, heartbreaking melee where the echoes of the Emperor's lost servants fought their final phantom battles. The true attack, however, was on the minds of the Vostroyans. With every step closer to the cathedral, their own memories began to fray. A veteran would suddenly forget how to load his laser gun, the knowledge of a lifetime of soldiering simply vanishing. A tank driver would forget which lever controlled the treads, his vehicle grinding to a halt in confusion. Commissars found their litanies of hate turning to meaningless babble on their tongues. This was the entity's ultimate defense. It was unmaking them as soldiers, erasing the very discipline and training that defined them, turning them back into frightened, useless men. Voronozov, riding at the head of the column in his command tank, the Will of Iron, felt it himself. The name of his firstborn son, dead for 300 years, became a hazy, indistinct shape in his mind. The faces of his old comrades, men he had bled with for centuries, began to blur. He felt his 1,000 years of tactical knowledge, his encyclopedic memory of 100,000 campaigns, leaking away like sand through his fingers. He was being hollowed out, reduced to a mere shell of the commander he had been. In a moment of terrifying clarity, he realized that if he lost himself, the entire offensive would collapse. He was the anchor, the focal point. His will was the only thing holding the fragile reality of his army together. He threw open the hatch of his tank, exposing himself to the full phobos depot of the memory-eating aura. He shut his eyes, ignoring the phantom legions fighting around him, ignoring the creeping blankness in his own mind. He ceased to be a general. He ceased to be a soldier. He became a single, focused point of memory. He recited the names. Colonel Ivan Petrov, 3rd Vostroyan, died siege of Vrax. Major Elena Soloviev, 112th Mechanized, fell on Taros. Sergeant Mikhail Orlov, Iron Spire Guard, lost to the green tide at Armageddon. He went on, a human litany, dredging up the ghosts of his own past, not as failures or sorrows, but as facts. He listed every officer he had lost, every campaign, every victory, every defeat. He used his own history, the vast blood-soaked tapestry of his 1,000-year life, as a shield. He defined himself by the names of his dead, by the litany of his duty. Each name spoken was a blow against the encroaching void, a declaration of existence. His voice, amplified by the tank's voxcasters, rolled across the battlefield. His men, lost in their own confusion, heard it. They latched onto it. The familiar names, the shared histories, the litany of their own legion's bloody past became an anchor for their dissolving minds. They began to chant with him, the names of their own dead, their own squads, their own forgotten battles. The air filled with a chorus of remembrance, a defiant roar of history against the entity that sought to erase it. They reached the base of the cathedral, a great army of men shouting the names of their dead, their memories held together by the sheer, stubborn will of their commander. They had fought their way through a war against physics, against sorrow, against fear, and against their own dissolving minds. They had paid an unimaginable price, their forces shattered, their sanity hanging by a thread. But they had reached the Loci. They had won the right to their damnation. The Cathedral of Forgotten Echoes was not built of stone or metal, but of solidified memory. It was a vast crystalline edifice whose facets shimmered with images of battles that never were, of legions that had been erased from history, and of heroes whose names were lost to the void. To stand before it was to feel the weight of 1 billion forgotten souls. At its heart, a vortex of pure, silent nothingness pulsed, a wound in reality that was the focal point of the silent annihilator on this world. It was here, at the threshold of oblivion, that Lord Marshal Evgeny Voronezov would wage his final battle. He did not enter the cathedral. He knew that to step inside would be to have his very essence, his soul and history, unraveled in an instant. The battle had to be fought on the threshold, a contest of will on the precipice of the void, while his surviving men, their numbers catastrophically depleted, formed a desperate, ragged perimeter around the locusts, holding back the phantom echoes and the last vestiges of the planet's rage. Voronezov walked alone to the great arching entrance of the crystalline structure. He planted the grand standard of the Vostroyan 77th in the obsidian ground, its tarnished eagle a small, defiant speck of gold against the overwhelming emptiness of the portal. He drew no weapon. His power saber and archaic las pistol were useless here. This was a duel of concepts, a war between being and unbeing. He stood before the vortex, a lone armored figure, and prepared to pit his soul against a sliver of a god. The entity's presence filled his mind. It was not a voice, but a feeling, a cold, serene, and utterly seductive invitation to peace. It showed him the entirety of his life, not as a series of memories, but as a burden. It showed him the weight of his 1,000 years, every command given, every soldier sent to his death, every world burned, every moment of grief, every scar on his soul. It presented his duty not as an honor, but as a chain. It showed him the endless grinding futility of the long war, the slow, inevitable decay of the Imperium, the ultimate heat death of the universe. It offered him a release from it all. Not death, which was simply another state of being, but a true and final end. Annihilation, the chance to have never been. No memory, no pain, no duty, no Vostroya, no sin. Just the clean, perfect peace of absolute nothingness. It was the ultimate temptation for a soul that had known nothing but war for a millennium. Voronezov felt his will begin to buckle. The sheer logic of the offer was undeniable. Why endure? Why fight? His army was spent, their fate sealed. His crusade was a lie, his reward was a curse. What was left to defend? He closed his eyes. He let the seductive promise of the void wash over him, and in the heart of that cold serenity, he searched for a reason. He did not find the Emperor's light, for it was too distant here. He did not find righteousness, for his hands were stained with the blood of galaxies. He did not find hope, for there was none. He found spite, a deep, hard, and utterly Vostroyan stubbornness, a refusal to yield, not for any grand purpose, but simply because it was not in his nature to do so. He had been given an order. He had a duty to perform. The sheer, grinding, bloody-minded obstinacy that had seen him through 1,000 years of war became his anchor. No, he projected, not with psychic power, but with the sheer force of his own being. The word was a rock thrown into a placid pool of nothingness. The entity's seductive peace faltered, replaced by a sense of cold confusion. It could not comprehend resistance that was not born of hope or faith, but of simple, intractable defiance. "You offer me peace." Voronezov's thoughts were a snarl. "My people have not known peace for 10,000 years. It is an alien concept. You offer me an end to suffering. Suffering is the forge of the human soul. It is what gives us weight. It is what makes us real." He opened his eyes, and they burned with a cold, human fire. "You are nothing. An absence. A void. I am Evgeny Voronezov, Lord Marshal of the Vostroyan Firstborn. I am the sum of 10 million deaths. I am the memory of 1,000 years of war. I am a monument of pain and duty and loss. I have more substance in my little finger than you have in your entire being. You cannot unmake me because I am already full." He took a step forward, towards the vortex. The ground at his feet began to shimmer, to lose its solidity. He ignored it. He focused the entirety of his consciousness, the full weight of his history, into a single conceptual blow. He did not attack the entity. He asserted his own existence with such ferocious intensity that it acted as an attack. He remembered the ice-sharp wind on Vostroya's mountains. He remembered the taste of his first ration bar. He remembered the recoil of his first laser gun. He remembered the face of every soldier he had ever decorated, and every soldier he had ever condemned to death. He held his entire blood-soaked, weary, and glorious existence up as a shield, as a mirror to the void. The vortex recoiled. The serene peace was shattered by a feeling of offense. The silent annihilator, a thing of pure negation, was being assaulted by an overwhelming assertion of being. It was like trying to drown a bonfire with a vacuum. Voronezov pressed his advantage, stepping closer still, his mind a raging storm of memory and identity. He was no gray knight. He had no psychic catechisms, no wards of purity. He had only the sheer, unyielding mass of his own life. He was fighting a god of nothingness by being the most absolute something he could possibly be. He was the embodiment of the human condition in the 41st millennium, a creature of sublime resilience defined by suffering and too damn stubborn to die, even when offered the sweetest oblivion. The ground around him began to solidify again. The shimmering receded. The pulsing of the vortex became frantic, chaotic. He had done the impossible. He had wounded a concept. He had not defeated it. He could never do that. But he had pushed it back. He had bought the precious moments his army and the Grey Knights would need. He stood alone in the apocalyptic chaos of the final battle, a clash of titans where one was a sliver of an anti-god and the other was just a man who refused, with every fiber of his being, to be forgotten. As Lord Marshal Voronezov held the abyss at bay through a singular, monumental act of will, the final phase of the plan began. Across the war-torn continent, at the 4 other Loci, and at the polar nexus where the Grey Knights had established their sanctum, the sky began to bleed. The sickly green firmament tore open, not to the madness of the warp, but to the cold, hard void of real space. Through these tiers, vast, silver-black structures descended on pillars of cold, ethereal light. They were soul forges, arcane machinery of the Ordo Malleus, devices that blurred the line between technology, metallurgy, and outright sorcery. Their purpose was as profound as it was heretical, to rewrite the fundamental nature of a planet. A psychic command, cold and absolute, echoed from Inquisitor Crane's vessel in orbit, a signal that resonated not in the Voxnet, but in the very soul of every surviving Vostroyan. It was a single imperative word: endure. At the chasm of ungravity, The survivors of the 4th and Ninth Corps stood upon their precariously held bridges and ledges. As the Soul Forge lowered into the heart of the gravity vortex, a wave of incandescent silver energy washed over them. The men screamed, a single unified cry of agony and transformation. Their flesh, their bones, their carapace armor all began to transmute. The process started at their feet, a creeping tide of metallic change. Their worn leather boots melded with the obsidian rock, and a wave of living iron, cold and gray, swept up their bodies. It was not a coating, it was a conversion. Muscle became interwoven cables of steel, bone became adamantium struts, blood became a sluggish, conductive fluid. Their greatcoats stiffened and became immobile plates, their fur collars turning to filigrees of unyielding metal. Their laser guns, still clutched in their hands, fused into their gauntlets, becoming inert, symbolic extensions of their new forms. Their faces, caught in expressions of shock, agony, or grim defiance, were frozen in iron, their eyes becoming dead crystal lenses. But their minds, their consciousness, were not extinguished. They were drawn out, stretched, and then slammed back into their newly forged bodies, locked within a prison of their own flesh-turned metal. They became statues, but statues that could still think, still feel, still remember. They were sentient monuments to their own sacrifice, their souls now anchored to the very fabric of the chasm, their collective belief a permanent counterweight to its impossible physics. The same horrific miracle was unfolding across the planet. In the shattered remains of the glass forest, the men of the 2nd Armored Legion, many still inside their tanks, underwent the same transformation. Man and machine fused together. Lehman Russ battle tanks became solid, unmoving blocks of iron, their crews eternally entombed within, their collective will a bulwark against the forest's psychic lament. At the Shadow Volcano, the Vostroyans of the 11th and 21st became iron sentinels forever standing guard in their trenches, their souls a perpetual burning light that held the tangible darkness at bay. At the Cathedral of Forgotten Echoes, the process was the most terrible of all. As the silver light of the Soul Forge descended, Voronezov felt his strength begin to fail. The entity, sensing the ritual, redoubled its efforts to unmake him. But as the wave of transmutation reached its perimeter, his men, in their final act of conscious loyalty, lent him their strength. As their bodies turned to iron, their minds, their memories, their very identities flowed towards their commander. It was a torrent of a million lives, a million histories, a million loyalties, all pouring into the mind of one man. Voronezov screamed, his physical voice lost as his own body began to change. But his mental voice was a supernova. He was no longer just Evgeny Voronezov. He was the Vostroyan 77th. He held the memories of the trooper who died in the chasm, the tanker who wept in the forest, the digger who faced the dark. He absorbed the entirety of his army's being into himself. His body, standing before the vortex, became the focal point of the ritual. The living iron that consumed him was different. It was darker, denser, laced with veins of psychic silver. He grew in stature, and his form swelling until he was a titan of iron and grief, 20 meters tall. His face, frozen in a silent, eternal roar of defiance, was a mask of cold fury. The grand standard of the Legion, which he had planted in the ground, was absorbed into his form, its eagle crest emerging on his massive chest plate. He had become the ultimate warden, a colossus forged from the souls of his entire army, his will now the unified will of millions. With this newfound impossible strength, he delivered the final blow. He did not strike. He simply stood. He became a fact, an immovable, undeniable object of such immense spiritual mass that the void could not comprehend it. The vortex at the heart of the cathedral sputtered, shrank, and then collapsed in on itself, silenced not by a weapon, but by the sheer, overwhelming presence of a unified legion of souls embodied in a single iron form. The soul forging was complete. The psychic storms across the planet ceased. The kaleidoscopic colors of the atmosphere faded, replaced by a uniform, neutral gray. The rivers of sorrow stopped flowing. The crystalline forests fell silent. The entire world became still, a perfect monochrome sphere of iron and dust. In orbit, Inquisitor Crane watched on his view screens as the last of the impossible energies of Cerberus Secundus were neutralized. The prison was sealed. He looked upon a world now populated by millions of silent, motionless Vostroyan statues, each one a sentinel in an eternal, conscious vigil. Regiments stood in perfect parade formation in the valleys. Tank columns were frozen in an eternal advance across the plains, and at the heart of it all stood the colossal Iron Titan that had once been Lord Marshal Voronozov, a silent king reigning over a dead world of his own damned soldiers. The victory was absolute. The Vostroyan 77th had achieved their objective. They had contained the silent annihilator. But the cost was a pyre so vast it could not be measured in lives, but in the currency of eternal, conscious damnation. It was a victory, but it felt like the most profound defeat the Imperium had ever suffered. The silence that followed the soul forging was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was not the mere absence of noise, but a profound and total stillness that seemed to have devoured sound itself. On the bridge of the Sword of Damocles, the only audible noise was the quiet hum of the ancient vessel's life support and the faint crackle of Crane's augmetic limbs. The Inquisitor Lord stared at the main pict feed, his burning blue eyes reflecting the image of the newly remade world. Cerberus Secundus was gone. In its place hung a perfect sphere of dull gray iron, featureless and inert from orbit, betraying nothing of the millions of souls trapped in its matrix. The name on the star charts had already been changed by his authority. It was now designated Wardstone, the remnants of the Vostroyan fleet, a ghost armada of crippled, scarred vessels, drifted aimlessly in the high orbit they had fought so hard to achieve. Their mission was complete, but there were no orders to follow, no commander to issue them. The crews, the ratings, the shipmasters were in a state of collective shock. They had watched the silver light of the soul forges descend, had felt the psychic scream of their comrades being transmuted, and had then witnessed the world below fall utterly silent. They had won, they were told, but there were no victory celebrations. There was only a hollow, gnawing emptiness. "The binding is stable," Brother Captain Arian's telepathic voice was a flat, dispassionate statement of fact. He and his Terminator squad had teleported back to the Argent Shield, their part in the ritual complete. The entity is contained. Its psychic signature has been reduced to nearby zero. It sleeps trapped in the Vostroyan matrix. And the Vostroyans? The question came not from Crane, but from one of his acolytes, a young interrogator whose face was pale with horror. It was his first mission with the Lord Inquisitor, and the scale of what he had witnessed had clearly shattered his Academy Forge resolve. "They endure," Crane's mental voice replied, without a trace of emotion. "They are the Matrix. Their consciousness, unified and indivisible, now forms the operating system of this prison. They stand their eternal watch." The Inquisitor gave his first orders of the new era. They were cold, precise, and merciless. A signal was sent to the surviving Vostroyan ships. It contained no commendations, no explanations. It was a simple data burst containing a new set of astropathic coordinates and a single command: depart. They were to return to the Segmentum Pacificus command on their own, their numbers so depleted they were no longer a legion, but a scattered refugee fleet. Their command structure was shattered, their Lord Marshal a mountain of iron on a forbidden world. They were now a loose end, a dangerous collection of witnesses. As the Vostroyan ships one by one turned their battered prows towards the Mandeville Point, their journey home a prospect of shame and confusion rather than triumph, a second phase of Crane's plan unfolded. The Sword of Damocles and the Argent Shield did not follow. Instead, they began a slow, meticulous circuit of the Wardstone system. Every comms buoy the Vostroyans had deployed was vaporized by lance strikes. Every orbital sensor station was blasted to atoms. Every trace of their passage, every scrap of data, was systematically erased. The shattered front was not a line of battle, but a line of memory. Crane was not consolidating a victory. He was sanitizing a crime scene. The sacrifice of the Vostroyan 77th was too terrible, the methods used too heretical, the existence of the silent annihilator too profound a threat to ever be known by the wider Imperium. This victory had to be buried, locked away in the deepest, darkest vaults of the Inquisition. On the bridge of the Argent Shield, Brother Captain Arian oversaw the psychic scrubbing of his own Grey Knights. The warriors of the Sixth Brotherhood who had participated in the ritual knelt in meditation chambers, their minds open to the chapter's librarians. The specific memories of the Vostroyans, of the soul forges, of the entity's nature, were carefully excised and locked away behind psychic wards. They would remember a great battle against a powerful demon, a hard-won victory, but the awful specifics would be lost to them. Only the highest echelons of their order, and the Inquisitor Lord himself, would carry the full, untainted burden of the truth. The aegis of their faith could not be allowed to be tarnished by the knowledge of the methods used to secure it. The final act of this immediate, chaotic aftermath was the most chilling. As the last of the Vostroyan transports vanished into the warp, a single heavily encrypted message was sent from Crane's astropathic choir. It was addressed to the High Lords of Terra, a report so secret that its couriers would be mind-wiped and executed upon its delivery. Voronozov watched it all, a silent, all-seeing god on his new throne. His consciousness, now a vast distributed network that permeated the entire planet, was aware of the departing fleet, the systematic erasure of his legion's history. He, who was the sum of all their memories, was now the only one left to remember. He felt a cold intellectual pang of what might have been called betrayal, but the emotion was distant, muted. He was no longer a man. He was a function, a system. His purpose was to watch the prisoner in his core, and this external tidying of history was irrelevant to that duty. He was the wall, and the world outside the wall was no longer his concern. The shattered front was the line between his past life and his eternal present, and as he watched the last of his ships fade away, he felt that line being drawn in indelible eternal iron. The Vostroyan 77th was alone, their victory complete, their damnation absolute, and their very existence now a secret kept from the galaxy they had saved. Inquisitor Lord Crane stood in the orrery of souls aboard his flagship, a chamber where holographic representations of galactic phenomena were rendered not by light, but by captured psychic energy. Before him, a miniature replica of the ward stone hung in the void, a sphere of perfect placid gray. For all its apparent calm, the orrery registered it as an object of immense psychic weight, a singularity of spiritual density that bent the simulated currents of the warp around it. The binding was holding. The victory, by all metrics available to the Ordo Malus, was secure. Yet Crane felt no triumph, an ancient gnawing dread, a sensation he had not truly felt since his first encounters with the abyssal things that swam in the Imperium centuries ago, coiled in his gut. His victory felt thin, brittle. He had plugged a leak in a dam, but in doing so, he had become aware of the sheer, unimaginable weight of the ocean pressing against it. He commanded his Logis engine to replay the final moments of the soul forging. He focused not on the grand spectacle of the transmutation, but on the subtle, almost imperceptible psychic resonance that had been emitted at the instant the binding was sealed. It was a fleeting, high-frequency chime that had barely registered on his most sensitive instruments, an echo that had radiated outwards from Cerberus Secundus, not through the warp, but through the fabric of reality itself. At the time, he had dismissed it as a metaphysical byproduct of the ritual, the sound of a conceptual lock clicking into place. Now he was not so sure. He ran a simulation amplifying the signal, extrapolating its trajectory in nature. The result that spooled out onto the data slate made his blood, what little of it remained in his desiccated veins, run cold. The signal had not dissipated. It had propagated, traveling faster than light, faster even than thought, on a carrier wave of exotic particles that had no business existing in their dimension. It was a directed signal, a focused beam of information, and its destination was nowhere, or more accurately, everywhere and nowhere at once. It was aimed at the deep, intergalactic void, the absolute starless dark between the galaxies. It was a resonance, he whispered, the words spoken aloud a shocking breach of his usual silent composure. The acolyte attending him flinched. Not an echo, a resonance. A tuning fork struck here to be heard elsewhere. The awful galaxy-shattering implication crashed down upon him. The silent annihilator, the conceptual void they had fought and bled and sacrificed 10 million souls to contain, was not the true threat. It was, as his own briefing had stated, an echo. He had failed to grasp the true meaning of the word. It was not a remnant, but a projection. A listening post, a scout, a sliver of a far greater, vaster consciousness sent out to taste the reality of their galaxy. And by sealing it, by encasing it in a shell of 10 million unified souls, they had not silenced it, they had amplified it. They had created a psychic lens, a perfectly tuned instrument of such spiritual density that, when the binding ritual struck it, the resulting chime, had rung across dimensions, a clear, powerful signal that said, "Here, I am here, and I have found something." The true ungod, The parent entity that slumbered in the absolute zero of the void between galaxies had stirred. Crane's mind, a fortress of cold logic and inquisitorial certainty, was besieged by a terror so profound it threatened to crack his sanity. He envisioned a sentience so vast that a galaxy was but a petri dish, a consciousness so alien that the concepts of chaos and order, of life and death, were meaningless distinctions. The Chaos Gods were a cancer born of their own galaxy's turbulent emotions, a familiar, if monstrous, enemy. This was something other, a predator from outside the system entirely. The victory at Wardstone was not a victory at all. It was a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. They had not imprisoned a monster. They had activated a beacon. They had saved the segmentum from a conceptual brushfire, only to alert a cosmic firestorm to their existence. This new war, the one whose whispers he could now faintly hear on the edge of reality, would not be fought for the soul of mankind. It would be fought for the continued existence of existence itself. His final report to the High Lords, which he now began to compose with trembling metallic fingers, was a masterpiece of omission and lies. He reported total success. The threat in the Cerberus system had been neutralized, the demon permanently bound. The Vostroyan 77th had been instrumental in the victory, their sacrifice securing the sector. He recommended the entire sector, now renamed Sector Prohibitus Umbra, be placed under the highest level of interdiction, not to contain a threat, but to protect the sanctity of the Legion's glorious sacrifice. He was burying his failure under layers of sanctimonious honor, but for his own most secret archives, the records that only a handful of Inquisitor lords would ever see, and only then upon his death, he wrote a different truth. Let it be known that on this day, we won a battle against a shadow, he inscribed into the crypto-locked data wafer. In doing so, we have awoken the thing that casts it. We have traded a millennium of security for an eternity of dread. We have bought time with a currency that will indebt our entire species for the rest of its miserable existence. May the God Emperor, if he still watches over us, have mercy on our souls, for we have failed in a way that no one but we will ever understand. The whispers of a new war were no longer whispers. To his terrified, newly opened senses, they were the sound of a great and terrible eye, billions of light years away, slowly beginning to open. The purge of memory was as absolute as the soul forging itself. Where the Vostroyans had been rendered into iron, their history was rendered into ash. The process was methodical, multi-pronged, and executed with the chilling efficiency that only the Inquisition could command. Inquisitor Lord Crane, his soul burdened with the terrible knowledge of the greater war to come, understood that the Imperium could not be allowed to know the truth, not out of shame, but out of mercy. The knowledge of the ungod was a psychic poison, and the tale of the Vostroyan 77th was the vector. The first step was the declaration of the Sector Prohibitus. The entire Cerberus sector and its surrounding buffer zones, a region spanning hundreds of star systems and dozens of once-inhabited worlds, was expunged from all official Imperial charts. Navigators who knew the routes were taken into the custody of the Ordo Hereticus for re-sanctification, a process from which none returned. Astropathic choirs that had relayed even the most trivial of messages from the Vostroyan fleet were purged and replaced. The sector became a ghost on the map, a blank space guarded by automated defense platforms and black ship patrols, its name a whispered warning to any who might stumble upon its forgotten coordinates. The second step was the management of the survivors. The shattered remnants of the Vostroyan 77th's fleet, carrying the ratings, servitors, and support staff who had not made planetfall, limped back to the Segmentum Pacificus command at Hydrafer. They were not greeted as heroes. They were met by a cordon of ships from the Ordo Hereticus, their decks lined with stormtroopers in the charcoal gray and crimson of the inquisitorial militant. The Vostroyans were informed that upon their return, a virulent, warp-tainted plague had been discovered in their ranks, a consequence of their campaign against the arch-enemy at Cordell. Under the guise of a quarantine of absolute necessity, the entire surviving flotilla, some 200 ships and their nearly 3 million crew, were escorted to a barren, isolated moon. There they were subjected to the care of confessors and chirurgeons of the Inquisition. The process was long and agonizing. Through psychic interrogation, hypnotic suggestion, and surgical memory wipes, every trace of their time in the Cerberus system was scoured from their minds. They were left with a jumbled heroic narrative, a glorious final battle on Cordell, a mysterious warp storm, the tragic but honorable loss of their ground forces. Their grief was real, but its cause was now a lie. Their ship logs were confiscated and destroyed, replaced with forged accounts that matched the new official history. The men and women of the fleet were eventually returned to service, scattered across the segmentum, their minds scarred with gaps they could never explain, forever haunted by a loss whose true nature they would never recall. The third and most delicate step was the revision of the official Imperial record. Crane, using the full weight of his authority as an Inquisitor Lord, personally oversaw the alteration of the Administratum's archives. The Vostroyan 77th Army Group, heroes of a 1,000-year penitent crusade, were given a new final chapter. Their official fate was recorded in the Roll of Honor as lost with all hands in the Cerberus warp anomaly while prosecuting the final stages of the Cordell pacification. Their honor at last is intact. They were made martyrs to the very warp storm that was invented to hide their true fate. It was a neat, tragic, and suitably heroic end that raised no questions and invited no investigation. All records of their final orders from Crane were redacted, sealed under the highest authority, and buried in the vaults of Terra, never to be seen again. For the Grey Knights of the Sixth Brotherhood, the scouring was a sacred internal duty. Brother Captain Arian and his librarians moved through the ranks of their battle brothers, placing seals of ignorance upon their minds. The warriors would remember the fight, the courage, the sacrifice. They would honor the Vostroyans as brave soldiers who fell in a great battle. But the nature of the enemy, the soul forges, the awful heretical truth of the final solution, all of it was locked away. This was not done to protect the Imperium, but to protect the chapter. The purity of the Grey Knights was their greatest weapon, and knowledge of such a fundamentally unclean victory could become a cancer in their souls. They kept the honor, but discarded the truth. The consolidation of Crane's secret was total. Within a single decade, the Vostroyan 77th had become a myth, a footnote in the histories of the Segmentum Pacificus, a tale of heroic sacrifice used by commissars to inspire new generations of guardsmen. The truth of the Wardstone, of the 10 million iron souls standing in eternal vigil, was a secret known only to a handful of individuals in the entire galaxy. Their damnation was buried, their victory erased, their names relegated to a lie. The scouring was complete. The memory of the greatest sacrifice ever made by an army of the Imperium was now nothing more than a ghost, a whisper of a new war that only one man could truly hear. The legacy of the Vostroyan 77th Army Group was one of ash and whispers. In the grand, blood-soaked annals of the Imperium, their final chapter was a masterpiece of noble fiction. They became the Honorable Lost, a glorious example of martyrdom whose tale was told to fresh-faced guardsmen on 1,000 worlds. Children on Vostroya itself grew up hearing the story of the brave 77th, who completed their 1,000-year penance and were lost in a warp storm, their final victory so pure that the Emperor had called them to his side in a single blazing moment of glory. Their banners, replicated and sanctified, hung in the great halls of the Vostroyan nobility, a constant proud reminder of a debt paid in full. The lie was perfect, seamless, and utterly believed. In the cold darkness of the Segmentum Obscurus, Inquisitor Lord Malachi Crane withered into little more than a whisper himself. For 3 more centuries he endured, his life sustained by arcane technologies, his mind a lonely prison for the most terrible secret in the galaxy. He watched the star charts, his ancient eyes seeking any sign, any faint tremor in reality that might herald the coming of the ungod. He became a pariah even within the Inquisition, a grim, silent specter obsessed with the void, his warnings of a threat beyond threats dismissed as the paranoid ramblings of a mind worn thin by centuries of staring into the abyss. When his time finally came, his passing was unmourned, and his secret archives were sealed, their contents deemed too cryptic and mad to be of use. The last conscious mind who knew the full truth of the Wardstone was gone, and the secret passed from memory into forgotten lore. And in the forbidden, silent space of the Sector Prohibitus Umbra, the Wardstone endured. For millennia, it hung in the void, a monument to a victory that was never celebrated. No starlight glinted off its dull iron surface. No solar winds disturbed the fine layer of cosmic dust that settled upon it. It was a world devoid of geology, of atmosphere, of life, of everything save purpose. To the few rogue vessels or unknowing Xenoscraft that blundered into the sector and whose navigators glimpsed it before their ships were torn apart by its automated defenses, it was an anomaly. a perfectly smooth sphere of metal where a planet should be, an object that radiated a sense of profound and ancient stillness. But on its surface, the vigil was kept. Millions of iron statues stood in the unchanging gray twilight, their forms untouched by time. Infantry squads stood in silent, perfect ranks in trenches carved from solid iron. The crews of Lehman Russ tanks sat at their stations within solid metal hulls, their gazes forever fixed on a horizon that would never change. And at the heart of the largest continent, the colossal titan that was once Voronozov stood as a mountain of defiance, his iron gaze fixed upon the memory of a vanquished foe. Their existence was a single continuous thought. The millions of minds, once individual, had merged over the aeons into a single, vast consciousness. The Voronozov Legion. It was a mind without ego or desire, a consciousness stripped of all things but two. Its first and primary function was to exist. The silent annihilator, trapped in the planet's core, was not dead. It dreamed. It dreamed of the perfect, beautiful piece of nothingness, and its dreams were a constant, subtle pressure against the bars of its cage. The Voronozov Legion was the reality that opposed this dream. Every moment of its existence was an act of war, a silent, continuous scream of "I am" against the prisoner's whisper of "You are not." It remembered every detail of its millionfold lives, every blade of grass on Vostroya, every drop of blood spilled on 100 worlds, and it used this tapestry of being as a shield, a wall of absolute reality to contain the void. Its second function was to remember. While the galaxy forgot, the Voronozov Legion remembered. It remembered the lie of absolution. It remembered the awful truth delivered by the Inquisitor. It remembered the march to the Lorekeeper, the agony of the soul forging, the face of every soldier as his body turned to iron. It held the true history of the Vostroyan 77th in its vast, silent mind, a perfect, unchanging record. They had been denied their history by the Imperium they saved, so they became their own historians, their own memorial. They were a library of sacrifice whose doors would never open. The balance of power in the galaxy had not shifted. The great game of chaos, Xenos and Imperium, continued its bloody, pointless course. But a new piece had been placed on a board so vast that no one even knew they were playing. The chime of the soul forging had crossed the void, and a power from the outer dark had taken notice. The wardstone, conceived as a final solution, was in truth only the first move. The Vostroyan 77th, the men who had sought only to reclaim their honor, had been granted immortality. They stood their post, silent and unseen, a legion of iron ghosts guarding a forgotten prison at the edge of nowhere. Their legend was a lie, their victory was a secret, their penance was eternal, their absolution was a curse that would outlast the stars.